Let's talk about the Sabbath. So I'm going to pause our usual through the study to camp out on the Sabbath here. So the first mention of Sabbath is in chapter 16. We get it on verse 23, in which tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. And then there is some instruction that is given as far as it relates to what is supposed to happen on the Sabbath. The one instruction that we do get from chapter 16 is that people are supposed to rest. It is supposed to be a day of rest. The other element is that, and it's an interesting one, is that everyone is to stay where they are on the seventh day. No one is to go out. Now, that doesn't mean that no one is allowed to leave their house. It means it's directly correlated to no one is supposed to go out and gather manna on the Sabbath day itself. This is actually where we get the 2,000 cubits rule, an extra biblical rule that was added. It's not in the Bible, but it is in Jewish teaching. It is a rabbinic rule, is that on the Sabbath you are only to travel 2,000 cubits. 2,000 cubits is roughly half a mile. And so to this day, practicing Jews in Israel or wherever, if they're still practicing this and holding to this, they will travel no more than half a mile. What else can we learn about the Sabbath? Well, we are going to do a little bit of a survey of the Bible. We're going to hit roughly 7 verses that all correlate to the Sabbath. So leave your marker here and join me. We're going to go all the way to Genesis. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 2, right at the beginning. Genesis chapter 2, verse 2. Give you a second to get there. Genesis 2:2. By the 7th day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. An important thing to note. The Jewish 7th day is Saturday. The first day of the week is Sunday. This is why the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. It's actually from sunset on Friday night to sunset on Saturday night. Let's continue on. I'll talk about modern application for how Jews treat it today in Israel, but let's keep flipping through our verses. Now we're going to go back to Exodus, but we're going to skip ahead to the 10 Commandments. Go to Exodus chapter 20. Exodus chapter 20 and the 4th commandment. Exodus 20, verse 8 through 11, we have the 4th commandment. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. Neither you, nor your son or your daughter, nor your male or female servants, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The Sabbath, as it's described here, is meant to be a day of rest. God chose to rest on the 7th day, and that as an example for us. God doesn't need to rest. He doesn't need additional energy. He doesn't need anything. He is fulfilled in and of himself. He could have done all of creation in 6 days and been done, and that's it. But he chose in Genesis to let us know that he rested as an example. If God chose to rest, we should also choose to rest. Additional text, continue on. Go to chapter 30. Flip over to chapter 30, Exodus 30. Exodus 31. I need to update my note here. It needs to be Exodus 31. Exodus 31, verse 12. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, you must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign between me and you for the generations to come, so you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy." And it continues on. An important thing to note is verse 15, whoever does any work on the Sabbath day is to be put to death. It mentions it several times. You can read it for yourself. There's two things that we pull out from this, is that one, it is to be a sign. This is a covenant. This is an agreement between God's people, Israel, and God. And it is a sign of that Israel is following the law, following God's covenant, following the fourth commandment, that they do no work on the seventh day and follow the different ordinances. Now, it also adds in that there's a penalty if you do work, and that penalty is very clearly spelled out in verses 12 through 18 several times. The penalty is death. It's quite severe. I'll talk about us not being under the law today in a second as we continue on. I've got a few more verses to hit. Well, actually, we're not even halfway through the verses. Another one, you don't have to flip there, but just for speed, Exodus 35:3. It adds, it reiterates, but also adds an additional element, that fire. You're not supposed to start up a fire on the Sabbath day. But I do want to flip to Deuteronomy chapter 5. So Deuteronomy chapter 5. Give you a second to get there. Deuteronomy chapter 5 is a restatement of the Ten Commandments. We have it in Exodus. We also have it here in Deuteronomy chapter 5. And the fourth commandment, still the Sabbath. And if you read from chapter 5, verse 12, we have an outline of the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. But verse 15 I want to hit on. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. This adds an additional element to the Jewish Sabbath. It is meant as a reminder of the Exodus, of God stepping in and saving Israel from their captivity, from their slavery in Egypt. It is a reminder that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand. It is to remember what God has done. It is for the Israelites as a reminder for what God has done as outlined in Exodus as we've been studying. So to recap, it's a day of rest. As God rested, so shall we. We get that from Genesis 2:3. We also get that from Exodus chapter 20. They're supposed to stay where they are. They're not to go out. That's from Exodus 16:29. They're supposed to stay with roughly half a mile or 1 kilometer, 2,000 cubits from their residence. Interesting, Acts 1:12. As a side note, Acts 1:12 references a Sabbath day's walk. It's actually talking about a journey that they made that was a Sabbath day's distance. So we know from that it was a half a mile or so, but we also know that this ordinance that was outlined in Exodus was taken literally as a distance that you can travel or not travel from your home. Don't work and don't cause any others to work. And then it is a reminder to remember the Lord and what He did for you. So application. Should we follow the Sabbath? Should we follow the fourth commandment? Are we required to? Jews treat the Sabbath as Friday evening to Saturday evening, so it's all day Saturday basically. Saturday is their holy day. Well, the question really should be, before we ask that, of what we should do, we should look and say, okay, well, what does the New Testament say about the Sabbath? What information can we learn from that? What does Jesus specifically say about it? And we're going to flip to Mark now. So go to Mark chapter 2. This is related to Jesus talking about the Sabbath. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. So near the end of chapter 2, Jesus says to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. Let's back up and actually pick it up on verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through grain fields, and his disciples walked along. They began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Picking heads of grain is considered work. They're working on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. The penalty is death. So the Pharisees are getting all upset. And Jesus answers, verse 25. He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priest to eat. And he also gave some to his companions." Verse 27, "Then he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." You can read chapter 3, verse 1 through 6 is another story of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And the Pharisees getting all upset. Jesus does a miracle and heals a man with a withered hand. And they say, what are you doing? You're working on the Sabbath. And Jesus is like, he's healed. Which is better, to do right, to follow God's commands, to heal, or to not? And in the same way, what Jesus is talking about is that they're starving and they're hungry and they need food. And Jesus gives an example. He's speaking to the Pharisees who are Jews, so he uses an example of a situation in which David broke a law of which he, hungry with his military, with his army, were starving, and they took, to feed his soldiers, they took some of the bread that was consecrated bread, which only the high priests were supposed to eat, as an example. The point that Jesus is saying here is critical, is the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath, meaning the Sabbath is a day of rest that is of benefit to mankind. It's not that we are required to do it, and because we're required to do it, we do it. We do it because it is of benefit to us. Let's continue on and see where Sabbath is mentioned in the New Testament. We're going to come back at the end when I talk about the fact that Jesus is the fulfillment of the law and that we're no longer under the law. I'll hit on that, and that directly correlates to what Jesus is getting at here. The Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. But in the New Testament, we have mention of the Sabbath on Mark 6, verse 2, Luke chapter 4, verse 31, and Sabbath is mentioned 10 times in the book of Acts, between chapter 1 and chapter 18. But in every one of those situations, it's in reference to either the day of the week or in reference to speaking to Jews on the Sabbath, because they gathered in the synagogue on the Sabbath day. So it is never correlated in the New Testament in these verses to something as a command that the new church, the New Testament church, the Christian church is to follow. It's never given as that command. Also, interestingly, Paul in Acts 18:6 is where Paul says, he's speaking to the Jews. As you'll remember, when the command was given to go from Jerusalem to Judea and to all the ends of the world, the gospel spread. The gospel spread from Jerusalem, and it spread across the Mediterranean. But when it first was spreading, it was all among Jews. It was all in synagogues. It was all to Jews that the message was given. Jesus was a Jew. All of the disciples were Jewish. In fact, every single author of this text, except for one, was Jewish. Luke. Luke is the only Gentile of all of the authors of our Bible. It's entirely written by Jews, and it was originally authored for Jews. It has total application for us today, but when Peter, when Saul, when they first, whose name is also Paul, his Gentile name was Paul, his Hebrew name was Saul, when they first were evangelizing, they went to the Jews in the synagogues. But we see here in Acts 18:6, Paul or Saul, if he's speaking to the Hebrews, he would have been known as Saul. When he goes to speak to the Gentiles, he's known as Paul. He says here, from now on, I go to the Gentiles. This is the last mention of the Sabbath. It is not mentioned again in the New Testament except for one verse, Colossians 2:16, which let's flip there. We've got two more passages to hit. Colossians 2:16. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. We'll hit on that again. Jesus is the fulfillment of the law. Do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. What Paul is saying here in Colossians is if one person calls a day holy, respect them. If that's what they call their holy day, their Sabbath, that's fine. In the same way, a religious festival, a new moon celebration, don't worry about these things. Don't judge people because of this. Then the final one that I want to hit on here is Romans 14. It's very similar to what we just read in Colossians. Again, Paul, Romans 14, verse 5 through 6. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. Whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God, and whoever abstains does so to the Lord and gives thanks to God. Now, this is correlating to whether we should eat meat or not. At this time, one of the things that was a pagan practice was to sacrifice animals to pagan gods. So the question came up is that they would sacrifice these animals, and then they might sell some of the meat in the market. And so the question was, as a believer, are we allowed to eat meat that has been sacrificed to idols? It's being sold in a butcher shop, but we know that when it was first killed, it was sacrificed to an idol. And the point here that Paul is making is that if that is a stumbling block for you, then don't eat meat that's been sacrificed. But it's also correlated to other elements. You can apply it to a person who doesn't drink. If you know the person does not drink and that alcohol is a stumbling block for them, then don't drink in front of them. In the same way, if somebody regards one day as their holy day, then respect that and allow that to be their holy day. So what should we do? Should we follow the Sabbath from Friday night at sunset to Saturday at sunset? Well, that's the Jewish Sabbath. That's what they do. Well, so why do Christians celebrate the Sabbath on Sunday? And why Sunday? What is the deal with that? Well, Christians, the early church in Acts, we do see a reference to the first day of the week being the day that they gathered. And the reason for that, again, the Jewish first day of the week is Sunday. There's several reasons for it, but the most obvious one is that Jesus was resurrected on Sunday. All the Gospels give that account of the fact that Jesus was resurrected on Sunday. And so they intentionally gathered on Sundays. But the thing is, there's no precedent set in the New Testament for having a worship service on Sundays. You look at the new church, they had worship services every day. You look at the Jewish church today, they have synagogue 3 times a day, every day. But nowhere does it say that for Christians, we are supposed to celebrate the Sabbath, that it's supposed to be on Sunday. Here's another question. Where does it say that it's supposed to be a day of worship? It doesn't. It doesn't. The Old Testament commandment is to keep the day holy as a remembrance to God and what He has done, and to not work on that day. Now, this is where it comes back to the fact that we're not under the law. So the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, the Mosaic Law, which is founded on the 10 Commandments, the 4th commandment is the Sabbath. All of these, the whole law, all is pointing to Jesus. It's pointing to a new system, to a new testament, to a new covenant that would be fulfilled in Jesus. Two verses that I want to hit on. You don't need to flip there. We've been flipping to so many. Romans 10:4. Christ is the end of the law, so that there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. The law was a series of rules. In fact, the Jews were so afraid of breaking the law that they created, I don't remember off the top of my head, I'll put it up here in reference, but I believe it's over 600 individual rules that are outlined in the Talmud, that are outlined specifically of all of these laws, all these regulations, all these things that they must do in order to be right with God. And the challenge, the problem with that is it's impossible. Trying to fulfill the law was impossible. You couldn't do it. No one was perfect. And Jesus came as the perfect person, and in doing so, he did live the perfect life and was perfect and is that sacrificial, spotless lamb, the Passover lamb that we spoke about when we talked about Passover. Galatians 2:16, know that a man is not justified by observing the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Christ Jesus, that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by observing the law, because by observing the law, no one will be justified. You cannot be good enough. You can't get to heaven by good deeds. It's impossible. No one but Christ alone was good enough. And when we talk about the sacrificial system, which I've spoken about before, sin requires a sacrifice. Atonement, something must be given in place to atone for a verdict. In a courtroom, sentencing, the verdict has been passed. You are guilty, and the sentence is death. And that's where Jesus comes in as our propitiation, which is just a fancy word for in place of. And in doing that, in Jesus doing what he did, he freed us from the law. We don't have to follow it. So do you have to go to church on Sunday? No. You don't have to go to church on Sunday. Do you have to follow the Sabbath law and not do any work on Sunday or on Saturday? No, you don't. You aren't under the law. But when we look at the Ten Commandments, we do see that there is good reason behind them, and we can still use them as a guide. They are a get to, not a got to. And so, following the Sabbath is a good idea. Don't fill it up with tasks that are work, but have it be similar to what God's original design was as a day of rest, a day of remembrance for what he has done for you, a day to spend with your family. If you choose to make it Sunday, great. Many of my peers, people who are pastors who work in churches, they take their Sabbath on another day. Why? Because they're working. They're working, whether they're leading worship or they're teaching or whatever it might be. For some people, they have to actually work. Their job requires that they work on Sunday. That's fine. Make it Tuesday. I know a lot of pastors that either make it Monday or Friday. Make it whatever day you want. We are free from the law, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't follow what God has designed as a good thing, established at Genesis as an example. So whatever day you choose, take a day where you don't do any work, where you rest, go for a hike, go do something as a family, but have it be focused on God. If you also worship God in that time through corporate worship, that's great. If you take some quiet time, if you read, whatever it might be, it's between you and God.